Okay, so yesterday where we left off, we just labeled number 3 as being the root hair. So all we really need to do over here is just identify that as being root hair. And then the other thing we can do is we're looking at this section right here. That's the root hair. That's the bit where the water enters. That's also, remember that that's an extension of the the cell membrane. Okay. So okay. Then we have those two. We've got these two black lines here and here, and all they're really pointing to on the inside of the cell is this first one here is pointing to the nucleus of that particular cell. So that one's going to a nucleus. I'm just going to label it underneath nucleus. Hopefully you guys have a little more room than I do. And this other one is just going to this lighter shade here. So it's just a vacuole. And it makes sense that you're going to have a nice big vacuole in your root, in the cell with your root hair, because vacuoles are where the plants store their water until they need it. So that makes sense that that's going to be in there. Okay. And then this whole thing is just a cutaway from what was happening in the plants here. So that's our sort of in-depth, right at the points of soil plant root interface. Okay, that's what's happening right there. Now there are a couple other things about the plant we need to identify. So we've got a line here pointing to this little thin line. You've got one right there. It's just pointing to something that's called a rootlet. Yeah. We'll get to that in a second. It's actually one word. Sorry, I got to make it fit. It's one word. It's not 2 words. And then we also have another line down here, and it's also just another rootlet. Okay. So to answer the question about what is a rootlet, well, a rootlet is, I guess the best way to do is think of the roots like you would a tree trunk, right? You've got the main trunk that runs down the middle of a tree, right? And then off of the main trunk, you get larger branches, and then those branches break down into smaller branches that break down into smaller branches that we call twigs when they fall onto the ground. Does that make sense? All right. So the plant's roots are set up the same way. You've got the main big thick root, and then it branches off into thinner roots, and then it branches down into really the tiny little rootlets. And off of the rootlets is where you get the location of all your root hairs and things like that. Okay? So if we were to break it down, you like sequentially in the order of like big to small, you'd have your main root, which we'll call A. We'll throw that on like right there. And then that goes into smaller roots. We'll call those B, like here. And then those would flow into rootlets. And that would be our equivalent of C, and that would be what we're dealing with down here. And honestly, like if we were looking for patterns in the world, it's very similar actually to the way our lungs are set up too, right? We've got the big windpipe, and that breaks into the bronchia, and that breaks into the bronchioli, and those break into the smaller things, where you eventually get down to where the alveoli and stuff like that in our lungs, where gas exchange actually happens. So it's a common pattern that you will see repeating over and over in science. Okay. So, but this is how the water is going to get into the plant. If we remember from our unit earlier in the unit when we were talking about diffusion and osmosis, the concentration of water is higher in the soil, so the water diffuses into the plant because it's trying to even out concentration gradients. Okay. Now, because the nutrients are dissolved in the water, when the water comes into the cell, it brings the nutrients that the plant needs as well. It's kind of a nice, fortunate thing that works out that way. Okay. All right, so that is essentially how water gets into the cell, or into the plant. And that's great. But now we gotta get it from down here all the way to the top of the plant, or to the leaves. The leaves are really where the water needs to go in a plant. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how the plant makes those tubules that we saw on Friday in our celery that were dyed red. But you probably don't want me to draw it. Nah, I better draw it because I'm making you draw it, right? Yep. All right, I'll draw it. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make 4 lines. No, 5 lines. You need 5 lines.
Where are we doing this?
Okay, just on the... You got room on the bottom of the page. Well, you could go on the back side, but there's going to be a couple... Yeah, you can probably do it on the back if you do it on the back. Okay, so you're gonna make tubule 1, tubule 2, 3, 4. Okay. And then, though, you're also gonna make these look like cells. So put some lines in them. Like this. It can be randomly. Yeah, it does a little bit. Yeah. And then we're going to make them look like cell walls, okay? And put a nucleus in each of them too, so that you know that they're alive.
No, that was yesterday.
All right. So what we're really going to do today, right now, is we're going to talk about those tubes that we observed on Friday. Oh. Okay. And those tubes that we observed on Friday, they're not actually called tubes. Their scientific name is xylem. Okay. So I don't expect you to commit the spelling of xylem to your memory. So we will spell it for you. Xylem. So if you ever find yourself playing Scrabble and you get X, I'm sure that word's worth a lot of points. Not that I would be, I'm horrible at focus. Xylem. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. We've got in the inside of our plant, we've got all these cells. So do you remember last week when we talked about what happened when the cell wall gets too thick? Remember how we talked about when the cell wall gets too thick that the cell inside actually dies? Because water and nutrients can't get past the cell wall. Okay. So that's what happens. The first thing that's going to happen is the cell wall is going to get thick. And because that happens, plants, the cell inside dies. Okay. All right. So here's where you're going to get angry at me. We actually need 3 versions of this tube. So, whoa. So what we're going to do is we'll take our thing here, and I'll tell you what, I'll draw it again too. Maybe I'll move this guy over. So then we're going to have the next step, and we'll have our tubes, but this time have a couple of these middle ones, leave them open. Okay. So what's going to happen now is we'll have talk about writing during writing. Okay. It's not labor intensive today though. So now we're only going to have like maybe a nucleus in this one and a nucleus in that one. Go around the outside, give those guys some nucleuses, give that guy a nucleus. Keep these ones in the middle mostly dead, okay? So now that those ones are dead, what's going to end up happening is we end up getting these little pores, and I'll show them in red, that develop in between the cell wall. That kind of connects this to this. And then this one will have a pore develop in there.
So can we just draw that in gray on ours?
Yeah, you can use gray on yours. In the textbook, it uses this really cool little 3D feature, but we don't have that. Okay. And what the red is showing here is that the cell wall is starting to dissolve. And then all that really happens in your third and final picture is you end up with, I guess I should keep the pattern going. You basically end up with these long tubes . So over time, once the cell wall dissolves, you get your long hollow tube, and the long hollow tube, that is what's called the xylem. So in our celery, the long hollow tube is where we found that red dye, those little spots of red dye. Okay, so so in our our trees that we see, the xylem is actually what we call wood. The part we call the wood, the yellow heart of the tree, that's the xylem. So the reason your tree grows an extra ring every year is because as the cell inside dies, it needs to find another way to get nutrients back down to the roots. So it's got to grow an extra layer on the outside of where all the water transport goes up. The other thing that happens is from time to time your xylem will get plugged and blocked, so then you need to find another tube to have your water flow. Okay. Does xylem make sense? All right. Let's